So the Glasgow Climate Summit, known as the Conference of Parties, met for the 26th time a few weeks ago. It was attended by 197 parties or countries, with 120 heads of state convening both virtually and in person in Scotland to discuss how the world would limit global warming below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The COP26 conference is organized by the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this meeting was the 16th revisitation of the Kyoto Protocol and the third for the Paris Accords, to both update the delegations on progress and shortfalls thus far. In fact, this conference finally completes the Paris Rulebook, or standards by which each country will formalize a set not just of goals, but interventions and collaborations to achieve 2030 targets set in Paris. The drafted resolution coming out of Glasgow is what many believe to be the last chance to make significant progress towards cutting global carbon emissions to avoid the undesirable consequences of a world hotter and more predictable than humans and our primate ancestors have ever seen in the last 800,000 years or so. But the media reports that have been coming out of the conference have been, well, mixed, to say the least. For one, the bevy of private jets was almost comical for a meeting touting to cut carbon. This BBC article uses flight tracking data to point out the dozens of dignitaries using about 40 times the fuel needed per person per flight than if they had just flown JetBlue like the rest of us plebes. Furthermore, the fancy fare consisted of a lot of meat and non-local seafood options that raised the ire of several critics shouting hypocrisy. Reportedly, the carbon footprint was nearly 2 to 4 times that of previous conferences in Copenhagen and South Africa, for example. However, Great Britain, the presiding country of the COP, has plans to purchase carbon offsets as they did in previous conferences, so I'll just leave that there for you to judge. But what was actually accomplished at this meeting? The main theme is time is running out. Everyone agreed that everyone needs to do more. Namely, commit, in theory, to limiting global mean temperatures by 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, or at least under 2. In my previous 2 videos summarizing the latest IPCC AR6 report, which serves as the scientific background of this meeting, I outlined why these targets are so critical, and I'll link to those up here. There are 4 main tenets of the COP26 final report, namely mitigation, financing, adaptation, and collaboration. The preliminary draft, as shown here, uses some key verbs like urges, invites, expresses to demonstrate the actionable steps the conference attendants hope to take towards achieving these lofty ends. I'll link to this as well for your perusal. Mitigation. The main targets of mitigating carbon focused on coal, deforestation, car electrification, and methane reduction. In nearly all of these aspects, the language is promising, but non-binding and not very specific. Soft, ambiguous terms like phasing down or halting were used instead of phasing out or stopping outright. Also, not all the key players like Russia or Brazil were party to all of these agreements. The main point, broad agreements are to cut global CO2 emissions in half by 2030. To achieve this, 153 nations signed on to reduce their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which accounts for about 80% of current global carbon emissions. The proposed projections will reduce emissions by about 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year by 2030. 48 countries signed up to be part of the Cool Kids Club, the PPCA, or Power Past Coal Alliance, which means they're committed to ending internal coal financing by the end of this year. 190 countries agreed to phase down coal, whatever that means, and approximately $20 billion is pledged to help South Africa and other developing nations transition away from coal. The language to phase down coal was a personal blow to Alok Sharma, the president of this conference, who apologized tearfully in his final address since the changes were negotiated at the very end in private meetings between the largest emitters, US, India, the European Union, and China. Now, China and the US did agree to cut emissions and finally put a cap on methane, which for the longest time has been misappropriated as a climate solution rather than an exacerbator. However, the details in the timeline in which the phasing down starts in 2026, the rate of reduction, and any hard limits on expanding coal or natural gas facilities in the short term were not really fleshed out or very specific. Some countries like the US and most EU nations are accelerating their carbon reductions before 2030, but others like Australia, Brazil, and Russia aren't taking any new measures at all. Overall, 100 countries agreed to cut methane by 30% by 2030. One of the biggest agreements by 137 nations is a global end to deforestation by 2030, which covers about 85% of the globe. This is big, especially since some of the major holders of mature rainforests like Brazil, Indonesia, and the Republic of Congo also signed on. But there was again limited details about monitoring or enforcing this agreement, and it's not binding. Furthermore, a few $1 billion from several countries were allocated to help countries and indigenous peoples fight deforestation. But of course, critics claim it's not quite enough. If deforestation were a country, it would account for the third largest carbon emitter based on the carbon sink losses alone. Projections suggest a 7 gigaton net reduction of CO2 per year by stopping deforestation. Now, this article by Ars Technica explores what these deforestation efforts may look like, why net zero deforestation and true zero deforestation must be clearly defined, because the difference between planting new trees to replenish timber is not an equal compensation. Destroying mature old-growth forest is far more harmful. They show analysis from the WRI, or the World Resource Institute, that up to 19 gigatons of CO2 from 33 million saved hectares of forest could be achieved if the goals are met. India finally signed on to pledging half of its energy grid will be from renewables by 2030 and net zero by 2070. However, looking closely at the wording in the pledge suggests it may only cover CO2 directly, but not all greenhouse gases. But it's a start. And finally, a global push from over 35 countries, 6 automakers, 28 fleet owners, and 15 financial institutions, among others, mostly in Europe, pushed for an expanded EV infrastructure and subsidies, hoping to cut 2.6 gigatons of carbon per year from car electrification. GM, Jaguar, Fiat, Volvo, Ford, VW will all be net zero by 2035, and more than 110 countries will sell full zero-emission vehicles by 2030. Adaptation. Now I'll discuss the plans to help countries adapt to losses and damages from climate change, since this was a huge part of this conference. The pledges from wealthy countries to help poor countries have fallen short historically. Back at the Copenhagen Convention in 2009, developing nations pledged $100 billion per year in climate financing for adaptation, but this has not been achieved to date. In this Nature article, we see that some countries have more than paid their fair share, including France, Japan, and Norway. But the US is lagging behind. These adjusted figures include the financial impacts of loans versus grants, and why simply stating the hard numbers is a bit misleading in practical terms. The fight for climate liability was a critical diplomatic sticking point in this conference, which underscores the reality of climate justice affecting the poorest countries most immediately, when the richer countries have historically produced the vast majority of carbon emissions to date. Now, this diagram from the New York Times neatly summarizes geographic sources of atmospheric carbon. Determining the fraction of climate-induced damages, ascribing proportionate financial penalties, and enforcing those liabilities is a fraught topic that unfortunately was addressed but not entirely resolved during the conference. According to the New York Times, the latest draft statement from the summit says very little about loss and damage except to cite, quote, the urgency of scaling up action and support, including finance for loss and damage. It says nothing specific about setting up a separate funding stream, nor how much. This led a bloc of island nations to say that emerging economies would not put forth more ambitious emissions reductions targets if we don't scale up the provision of finance, and this includes long overdue recognition of a separate and additional component for loss and damage. Basically, these countries are saying, we're not going to modernize unless you pay up, since you caused this mess in the first place. And with near-term estimates ranging from $300 to $500 billion per year in environmental damages from flooding, droughts, or cyclones, the damages are becoming less theoretical and much more material, especially for those vulnerable and developing nations without the financial solvency to pay for such damages. If we look at some of the reported figures that were disclosed, we see a lot of numbers, but not beginning with B, but rather M. 274 million pounds for Asia's Pacific regions, $27 million for disaster-resilient infrastructure, $67 million for European community resilience programs, etc. These figures are all cited in the summary draft shown here. 80 countries are now covered by the Adaptation Communication, or National Adaptation Plan, to increase preparedness for climate-related risks, with over $12.7 billion committed to financing adaptation efforts by 2025. Now, if we explore financing a bit further, other wide-scale financial commitments totaled over $500 million, which will be pledged by 2025 with effort to fund adaptation and mitigation efforts generally. A wide range of public and private partnerships, including the Public Climate Finance, a subsidiary of the Champions Group of wealthy nations like the UK, Sweden, New Zealand, Denmark, etc., the Task Force of Access to Climate Finance with some African and Asian countries like Bangladesh, Rwanda, and Fiji, as well as several multinational banks have all pledged a range of funds and expanding commitments towards renewable energy, adaptation, and green technologies. Notably, all the G7 nations except Japan are ending international fossil fuel subsidies, freeing up about $25 billion a year by 2022. The IMF is issuing a $650 billion trust and fund for developing countries to apply for subsidies and loans towards sustainable practices. Interestingly, 36 countries are requiring private sector companies to publicly disclose reliable information about climate risk to guide their investments, to promote transparency, and the development of a new international body, the International Sustainable Standards Board, to develop disclosure standards. And that's pretty cool. Now, of course, all these agreements come with more regulation and more collaboration. The formation of carbon markets as a means to regulate carbon emissions for trade or taxation was finally put in motion. For more information about how these markets were conceived, with an overview of the cost bases and potential economic impacts cited in Article 6, the foundation of this, I'll direct you to the summary link in the description below. This is a complex issue and merits its own discussion, but suffice to say that in a global capitalistic economy, determining the true cost for carbon emissions throughout its life cycle is a critical and essential step. The summary report from COP26 shows the key tenets of collaboration included both market and non-market standardization of carbon quantification and valuation, ensuring renewable energy sources are cost competitive by 2030, improving renewable power grid reliability, making steel net zero globally through offsets, and making low carbon hydrogen accessible and affordable. Several organizations and boards were established as well, including the Energy Transition Council in the UK, which works with multinational companies to transition to more sustainable practices, the ZEV, or Zero Emission Vehicle Council, to help with EV adoption, and the Clydebank Index of 22 countries to develop green shipping containers and large freight, which is a hugely important contributor to global emissions. Additionally, small business, local governments, healthcare providers, banks, and nearly 8,000 non-state actors signed the UN Champions Race to Zero campaign to help small industries measure climate progress at the local level, and the Champions Resilience campaign specifically to address the 4 billion people most at risk for climate impacts, and creates an investment line and communications platform to help mobilize interventions more efficiently. So in sum, I think Alok Sharma said it best.
This package charts a course for the world to deliver on the promises made in Paris. Collectively, we have acknowledged that a gulf remains between short-term targets and what is needed to meet the Paris temperature goal. As our pact brings parties back to the table next year to improve their commitments, to drive up ambition across this vital decade. And it emphasizes the urgent need to accelerate our efforts to turn targets into actions to keep 1.5 within reach. And that work must start now. I think today we can say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 degrees within reach. But its pulse is weak. And it will only survive if we keep our promises, if we translate commitments into rapid action, and if we deliver on the expectations set out in this Glasgow Climate Pact to increase ambition to 2030 and beyond.
1.5 is alive, but barely. This conference achieved the barest minimum of global standards for standardizing carbon reporting, emissions reductions, financing, adaptation and mitigation, energy grid modernization, and halting deforestation. If everything is achieved and on time, the world still has a chance to avoid the direst of climate consequences, but if history is a guide, such lofty goals may still be out of reach. And even with everything on track through 2030, global temps nearing 2.5 are probably more realistic, and that's not ideal. Of course, time will tell. This meeting took some key steps and inked some landmark agreements that tackled a wide range of topics, some of which for the first time, and the breadth of solutions was a welcomed expansion from prior conferences. So what do you think? Was the COP26 a success? Was it a waste of time? Do you think that 1.5 is still within reach? Comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And thanks for watching. Hit the like button and consider subscribing to help others find the channel. It really helps out a lot. And check out other videos about how you can limit your personal environmental footprint. See you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.